Hello and welcome to another episode of Language Therapy with Dr. K. This is a very special episode for several reasons. First, we're celebrating our 3-year anniversary. Second, it is our 25th episode. Third, we are recording live in front of an audience for the first time in the history of the podcast. Fourth, we are pulling back the curtains to meet and hear from the team behind Language Therapy. And finally, we're taking questions from the audience, putting me, the host, in the hot seat. It's been quite the exercise to reflect on the past 3 years, to assess my initial vision for the series, take stock of its trajectory and impact, and look forward to its future. We started this podcast in June 2020, in the midst of a global pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. Very soon after, the 2020 war started. And since then, the Armenian experience has been one of continuous existential crisis and angst. We are now in month 8 of the blockade of the Lachin corridor, the only road connecting the Armenians of Artsakh to the outside world, to basic necessities like food, medical supplies, and other essentials in what has become a devastating humanitarian crisis. Just yesterday, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, warned the world that in his expert opinion, Azerbaijan is committing genocide against the population in Artsakh, calling for the UN Security Council to bring the matter before the International Tribunal. For many of us, we are living in a strange sort of inharmonious reality, in realization of what is happening, but paralyzed by our feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, frustration, and disillusionment. On the one hand, going on day-to-day lives, on the other, secretly feeling guilty and ashamed for what the people in Artsakh are going through. In all of this, one may ask, what is the point of an academic podcast on language? I have asked this question to myself many times over the last 3 years. And in looking back at the content and knowledge we've produced, this is my response. Words matter. Language matters. Language choice matters. The words we choose to bestow on certain situations and events, the range or limitation of words we have to choose from, the way we talk or don't talk about certain things, the way we frame things, the stories we tell ourselves and about ourselves, the narratives we choose to subscribe to, they all matter because they define and shape our lived experience. Language plays a central role in how we construct our reality, how we experience it, comprehend it, and transmit it as part of the shared human experience. It matters that we have 2 names for the region under siege right now, Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh. It's important to understand the histories and legacies in their etymologies, but it's also important to know that the Artsakh constitution names them as equivalent terms, and no matter which you personally prefer, you need to have Nagorno-Karabakh in there because that's what international actors and media use. So if your story is going to be heard, you need to choose the right words to be part of the right conversations. It matters that we struggle with talking about racism in Armenian because we don't have the related associations that connect words with worldviews. In order to have the words we need for certain discussions, it's essential to expand the canon that forms Armenian intellectual thought and awareness. Once the social context and discourse are present, the words will find their proper associations. It matters that the transgressive language and framing of comedy shocks us, forces us to see ourselves and laugh uncomfortably, to vent, and possibly to heal. Yes, in times of war, especially during times of crisis. It matters that we frame the children of immigrants as heritage speakers and not false starters or defective native speakers, as has been done before. It matters that when we approach a mother speaking a non-English language in a park and say, "Speak English, you're confusing the child," we unpack the multi-layered assumptions, myths, and damage behind that. It matters when we choose to mark other forms of Armenian as Akhkatik dialects or Makra-Makur literary standards and nothing in between. It matters then when treating trauma, both individual and collective, people have access to their full linguistic repertoire in the healing process. Because as philosopher John L. Austin explains in his seminal series of lectures entitled How to Do Things with Words, by saying something, we do something. We're not simply declaring or constating true and false statements. We are performing actions with our utterances. The words we choose and the languages we use impact how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, how we engage with others, how we engage with the world. Quote, "All wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory," writes Pulitzer Prize-winning author and USC professor Viet Thanh Nguyen. I would argue that in both cases, but especially the latter, the theater of war is language. One could simply say this podcast is a significant part of my job at the Institute, as Geram said today earlier. We are, after all, an academic organization with the mandate to produce knowledge. But for me personally, it's become so much more than that. It's my fourth baby, my husband would argue, my passion project, my obsession, a part of my legacy, my lens through which I have come to see, discover, and unpack the world, because everything is somehow inevitably tied to language or its absence. It's been quite the experience to have colleagues, mentors, students, friends, and listeners across the world share their feedback on the impact of the series. From its use as teaching material in the classrooms of USC, UC Berkeley, UC Irvine, and the American University of Armenia, to the living rooms of Armenians in South America and the American Midwest, to the libraries of Polis, and the direct messages of Instagram, sharing how a certain episode provided the most insightful meditation on a particular topic in the Armenian context, how a certain concept helped reframe one's own assessment of their own sociolinguistic profile, how a certain conversation helped solidify or dismantle a particular family's language policy, how a particular guest became the role model one didn't think was possible to have, how the podcast series is one's routine grounding in Armenianness after traversing the country for business. So with that, we carry on. We keep doing what our mandate asks of us: create good, well-researched content, curate meaningful conversations, create cross-cultural contexts in which things Armenian are relevant and integrated with the wider human experience. Samvel Karajan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So the opening music you just heard was composed by this gentleman. He is also the magician behind every episode, behind how eloquent I sound, and behind how eloquent all of the guests sound. So why don't you say in your own words what you do on the podcast?
On the podcast, I assist with the recording audio of the podcast interviews. I also do the audio editing in post and the preparation and formatting of the audio to be released to streaming platforms.
When did you start working on the podcast? What stage in your USC experience?
I think it was the second semester I was here. I transferred from Glendale Community College. So it was the second semester I was here, which was the spring. It was right around the time that COVID began. It was around March 2020. So it was right around then. And so right as I got home and I knew that I was not going to be physically in USC anymore, language therapy and this podcast, working on this podcast, was a major kind of tie I had with the university still beyond my classes and education.
How did you try to align the music that you composed with what you assumed was my vision for this podcast?
Well, we had a lot of ideas of how to move forward with this podcast. A lot of curiosity, wonder, and ambition, I feel, was the energy at that time. And I wanted to capture that at the moment with creating the first kind of soundtrack, the intro and the outro music for the podcast. And that remained that way for such a long time, and it resonated with, I think, the theme and how we were imagining the podcast to be for a couple of years. And then when it came time to revisit the soundtrack and write something new, I really wanted to incorporate the maturity that I felt that this podcast had undergone and all of the knowledge it had attained, while maintaining that wonder, ambition, that sort of energy. And I really wanted to marry those ideas in creating this new soundtrack, which includes audio from interviews that we've done, as well as music, which is so expansive, and so I feel like in this experience, like ambitious.
I
in itself.
remember you hadn't told me that you had compressed sounds from all of the previous episodes, and you made sure that we were physically in the same place, and you put headphones on my ears. And
Yes.
then I listened the first time, and I was like, Samba, is that Francois Grosjean? And is that my voice? And is that so-and-so? And I realized
Yeah.
what you had done, and it was amazing.
Absolutely. It was that Francois Grosjean episode was I feel like an early kind of marker, but one that we felt we are most definitely on the right path in some way.
And I remember when I was trying to recruit you for the podcast, I told you the story of Francois Grosjean being like the god of multilingualism.
Yes.
And I had written him this cold email after having spent years of citing his work and reading his work, inviting him to the podcast that had only one episode thus far. And he responded with yes, and we had a staff Zoom meeting, and Silva was running late, and I had this giant postcard that said, God said yes. Silva finally joined, and I was like, God said yes, God said yes. And I reached out to someone saying, God has to sound good. Like, he's joining over Zoom from Switzerland. So
I'm really curious, like actually, however relevant this is, how you reached out to Francois with kind of us being very early on in the podcast process. We had like literally one episode out.
it was like,
What did you present to him? What did you tell him?
I had a link to my dissertation. It was like a 2.5-page email singing his glories, talking about how impactful. And I remember mentioning, we still just have one episode, but this is my vision. I want you to kind of be part of that opening panorama. And I couldn't believe he said yes. It set the tone for not setting limits
Yes.
for this podcast. I think it might be interesting for folks to hear about the trajectory we go through with every episode, because there is not a single person on this planet that has listened to every episode as many times as you have. One thing you all should know is, in case you don't know already, I'm a laugher and I'm a clapper. And almost every episode, someone will gently knock and say, stop clapping and laughing, because my ears are piercing and it's hard to edit. And I've just given up because I can't. So
Yeah.
I want to formally, publicly apologize for any damage I may have done to your hearing over these years, but it's going to continue. But maybe you can share the kind of trajectory from the moment we go into the studio and somebody sits right here and he gives a knock and we start recording to the moment you upload it to lip sync,
Yeah.
and then it goes out into the world. What do you do?
So I sit down, I set the levels on that machine. It's called an audio interface and mixer. I essentially make sure however loud the clapping is, however loud the sound the voices are, we're not going to have any problems. I download the audio, bring it into the software that I work on, and then after actually like a few of us or a couple of us listen over the podcast.
Well, then, sorry to interrupt, either you or Solange create a transcript of it
That's right.
that is then shared with me, and we do the content editing.
Yes. We read over it and we listen to it while reading it because of the transcript we've created, and while doing so, we begin to make these edits, which are the foundation of the edits that happen audio-wise with the slicing and the cutting. And essentially what we're trying to achieve is the maximum amount of impact of the message being conveyed, and the moments from the interview which we believe is able to convey the messages that we believe this person that we have on this podcast is specializes in somehow, or we are interested in knowing about. And then I receive the edits that they make on the Google Doc, and I go through an audio file that's like an hour and a half long, and I've become much more efficient at this process. I essentially go through the entire audio file and I make these cuts. I reattach the audio, like if you can imagine it like a line, you're making all these cuts in the line, and what you have to do is like you have to put the line back together with all these empty spaces in between.
And then he'll get a note that says, "This looks like it was cut. Fix it."
Yeah,
Or
so it's
could you remove this extra or this extra or and Samvid will write a note back. Shushan, that's not natural.
and appreciative of my perspective on the editing process as the person who's actually listening to the audio with the tools to make changes to it. There are things that on the transcript it might make sense to cut this entire paragraph out, but when you're actually listening to it, there's a breath before this paragraph, and then at the end of this, Shushan might say something and it doesn't make sense to make that cut. So
Yeah, it's always Samvid. You make the final decision. You're the expert here. I'm
Yeah.
not. I can make a suggestion, but he has void power.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's making these cuts, which are sometimes aesthetic things like us, and maybe even edits like background noises, fans.
Because every time we record, someone on this hall decides it's time to cross the hall or shake, a water bottle or something.
Yeah,
But
our fortune is not
or
good.
gardeners at home.
garden,
Yeah.
So after making these cuts, I put the audio back together, make it, like I said, sound as if nothing happened, because that's the goal. And I send it back, and we again do listens to it if we feel further edits need to be made. I come back, new transcript is made, I make these audio edits again, and then we arrive at a audio file which we believe is the episode itself. And once we do that, Solange and Shushan, you guys work really hard at creating the description title and really amazing creative parts of the entire process, which is thinking of things like a name, thinking of like the description, which I've had to like think about a couple times, and it's way harder than the audio.
Well, because we always have kind of a skeleton in the beginning, right? There's a reason the guest is chosen. There's a reason. There's a kind of a skeleton for the arc of the conversation, but the conversation doesn't always go the way because the guest can't read my mind or doesn't want to follow my lead. So the intros, titles, descriptions, all of it are written afterwards. So once we have this audio file, then I'll write an intro. I'll ask for feedback from the team because I want to make sure I'm not in my head and this is comprehensible to others. We come up with a title. Before Solange came on, and you guys will hear from her, I would ask Samvid to help me with the descriptions and make them less academic and less jargony. And you were magnificent at that. Some of the best descriptions. Samvid would do something, I would do something, we would marry it, and we would get the perfect description. I wanted to ask if there were any situations where we had kind of conversations about the ethics of editing. What parts should we edit out? Why are we editing out? Besides the obvious aesthetic ones, or the obvious kind of diversions that we would get into. Are there situations or are there moments you remember where we had kind of heart-to-hearts of what do we do with this particular context?
I remember there are moments where there's the personal aspect of the interview beyond sort of exploration of a certain academic idea. There are personal stories being told, first-hand accounts of events and very emotive and loaded moments on the podcast also. And I think we try to be very sensitive about where and how much it is our responsibility. What is our responsibility in handling these moments? How much what role they play in what we're trying to bring to the world. As you said previously, we are an academic institution, and we are trying to bring knowledge to our listeners and those who are listen to language therapy. And I can't think of a specific instance right now, but it's often us negotiating for long periods of time how much personal moments which are so powerful in conveying the ideas we want to explore with a guest.
Sometimes the guests themselves will email saying, I don't think that I said that gracefully, or I told a story that was too personal. Do you mind removing it? Sometimes we have guests who are Armenian by descent and they're public figures and they're used to being in non-Armenian contexts and kind of educating the world on things Armenian, and then they come to the Institute of Armenian Studies for a podcast and they have this built-in narrative of educating the world about things, and we have to say, like, no need to do that here. We're the Institute of Armenian Studies. We're interested in your language background, not necessarily the message. So there's, and everything truth. From expletives to, dynamics there. I don't think many people know that you have also been a guest on a podcast.
Yeah.
Which episode were you on?
That was Cheerios.
And who were you on Cheerios?
Who was I on Cheerios?
What?
The narrative, the moment. Well.
Were you a Cheerios or were you someone who called someone a Cheerios?
I was the victim. I was retelling them. Can I give like a 15 seconds?
Yes.
I was retelling the moment where I went to Glendale High School, and being in Glendale High School and being someone who spoke Armenian, I was often placed with the responsibility of helping students that just came to Armenia, helping them so much that I would often be held back from my own work, and I would be like communally within Glendale High School known as like the Armenian American kid who helped Norekat's kids a lot, and one of them, like, they would just call on me in such interesting ways to like come help me, like I wasn't being paid for that, and I would take up that responsibility, and that was my story, and then I brought my one friend on.
But what was so enlightening for me, when I had this idea of doing an episode on Cheerios, and I had this idea that it would break the pattern of the usual episodes, host and guest. I wanted different voices. And I brainstormed with you, and you said, well, I've been the victim of this Cheerios attack. And I said, would you share your story? You did. And then you said, but Shushan, it didn't bother me. To me, it wasn't an attack or offensive. It was just descriptive. Like, I am a Cheerios. Like they never said it in an insulting way. It was just
It was never an offense. It was more a description. Like, that's just, like, it's almost like a label, but with no malice behind it. And looking back at it now, and even in that moment, it was funny to me. The entire situation was funny. And the Cheerios name, and I really enjoyed how you were able to, I feel like no one was more equipped with the experience to approach the idea like you were, because you were able to get under that idea in the right way, and you understand what it meant. You understand why it was used and why it was so prominent within, I don't know, people of that age.
Yeah, and then Samuel recruited some friends as well. Yeah. Who were very proud.
Yeah, they were the, what's it called?
Assailants.
The attackers. They were the Cheetos attackers.
Yeah. Okay, final question. How has this podcast shaped your trajectory as a USC student, as a music composition student, and now graduate, as a bilingual person, because you have had firsthand access to these conversations like no one else?
Yeah. I think it really has changed and further developed my perspective on myself and the future of Armenians in the diaspora as a bilingual person. Thinking about, you hear all the time, when Armenians come to different countries and come to America, it's often like a stereotype that by the third generation, the Armenian language has been lost and is more something, it's more of a nostalgic kind of tool to communicate with one's grandparents. But in thinking about the actual future and what that actually looks like with the knowledge of language therapy, it's thinking about our responsibility, in that it's not only important for the next generation to stress the importance of the Armenian language, but to ensure that the circumstances are created for the Armenian language to be used, and for that need to be met by learning the language itself. And thinking about myself, it's so easy to be self-critical. Why don't I know as much Armenian as maybe certain family members and certain other community members might expect of me? And it's because the amount of Armenian that I know has allowed me to survive up to this point. And I haven't needed to know, even though I would like to know more, I would love to always grow in that area, but a lot of language therapy has helped.
Thank you, Samvel.
Thank you.
Okay, my next guest is my colleague Geram Murnetian, who was my first guest on the podcast. Geram.
Wow, how far have we come from that day in June to here? Yeah, what a day it was.
God.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say I didn't know what a podcast was when Geram was on his second podcast producing and hosting. So I was a podcast baby when this idea came up. And I don't even know if you know this story, actually, of how this happened, of how this idea came up. So because of the work I had been doing in my academic world, but also in my social world, people knew what I was doing. So every time Vach and I, my husband, would go to social events, people would pull me aside and be like, my kid's not speaking Armenian, my husband's not speaking Armenian, my mother-in-law is harassing me about my kid's Armenian, what should I do? And then I would disappear for like 45 minutes and Vach would be like, where's my wife? Da, 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 da. And I'm like, wait, we're saving one family at a time or whatever. And I would send books and I would do this. And Vach one day was like, can you just start a YouTube channel so like I could have my wife back? And then I joined the Institute and everybody knew that I work on language. So then colleagues, student workers would be like, Dr. K, what's that emoji of this? Dr. K, why do they say cheetah? Da, 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 da. And then one day during a staff meeting, this conversation came up. And I said, well, Vaj keeps saying I should have a YouTube channel. And then I think you or Salpi were like, there's a thing called a podcast, And I was like, okay. And then Salpi said, what if we did language anxiety? And I said, no. That makes me feel, I was like, what if we did language therapy? Because so many of my UCLA students had said after taking your class, it felt like therapy. Like I felt like I had this cathartic experience. And then the Dr. K part, I somehow, one of my dissertation co-chairs decided it would be a good idea for me to teach a class on Hindi Urdu as a heritage language in the United States. And I said, Olga, I don't know Hindi Urdu. She said, yes, but this is a class about heritage language theory and teaching it. You'll just learn the Hindi Urdu part. And I said, okay. So I designed a class on Hindi Urdu as a heritage language in the United States. And I was teaching to adults much older than me, much wiser and more worldly in New Jersey. And they said, instead of saying Garab Etian, and we had a whole lesson on Garab Etian, can we just call you Dr. K? And I said, sure. And that's where the Dr. K element happened. And we had, language therapy with Dr. K. But so we had this staff meeting. We had this conversation about a possible podcast. Shushan has no idea what goes into a podcast. I don't know what an intro is, what an outro is. I don't know what these wires do. I still don't know what any of the wires do. And then we're in the midst of COVID. The BLM movement is at its peak. Geram, who is not very expressive, in case that's not clear, very quietly at the end of a staff meeting says, by the way, I translated MLK's letters from Birmingham jail to Armenian. Just like that. So Shushan spent the rest of the day thinking about that. Why would quiet Geram do this? What does that mean that he did this? And then he shared his translation and I read it in Armenian and I realized I had never related to MLK the way I did when I read his words in Armenian. Never, ever. And I've been in this country since age 10. And so I turned to Geram and I said, what if we just do this as the first episode? I can't think of a more timely, of a more important topic than this. And Geram did one of these, sure, like this. And I said, okay. And he was like, do you have a title for the podcast? I was like, no. He was like, do you have an intro? Do you have an outro? Do you have this? I was like, I don't know what any of those things are. I just have an idea. And then I sent him like a 6-page outline. Oh, yeah. And he did one of those. Oh yeah. We set a recording date. We came to the studio and I was like, I don't know what's happening. Like, he's just going to sit there quietly. And then he showed up with like weapons galore. Like, we had the most amazing conversation where at some point I forgot that we're recording. I forgot that this is for a podcast. And I remembered why I was excited that Geram was my colleague, because when I joined, we had already shared some communications, and it just set the most amazing tone. Do you want to say something at this point? I talk too much.
Well, I don't know, you haven't mentioned it, but at the time of this, we had already been doing Word of the Day for like a year and a half.
Right.
So we were doing Word of the Day in this direction. So this is the
Yes.
background you usually see on Word of the Day. I would film it on the phone, and then we would post it. And we did almost 120, 130 episodes of Word of the Day, sometimes on the daily basis. Our student workers would be the audience. And we would do these words, and then we would get feedback from from our viewers who would give very detailed feedback sometimes, and then would ask more about words. I remember sometimes I would answer because people thought that Shushan was behind the Instagram.
Shushan didn't have Instagram at this
Yeah,
point. She
so-
didn't know Instagram.
So they would send questions to Shushan, and sometimes I would answer them if they were easy enough, or then I would pass on to Shushan. Shushan, who didn't, as she mentioned in the beginning, just realized what DMs were, right? Shushan would write 3-page answers to this, and I would be
With
like, "This
citations
won't-
and references.
Yeah, this won't fit in a Instagram response. So, and then and then COVID came around, so we couldn't do Word
Right.
of the Day anymore.
Right.
Every day I would drive to Shushan's house, and then in the house we would
By
film
the way, I don't
Yeah.
know if you know this. After lockdown and being stuck with my husband and kids, I hadn't seen another human being.
Yeah, I would go in full mask and
The first day Geram came for us to do a set was the first day in a long time I had showered, blow dried my hair, put on makeup, and I texted Salpi, our director at the time, and I said, Geram açkis lisna. I had never been so happy to see a human being as I was that day. I don't know if I've ever
Oh,
said
no,
this to you.
it was mutual. I hadn't been out
Well,
of
you
the
didn't
house.
show your excitement. I showed it.
I was wearing a mask.
It wasn't the mask.
It was even a point where our treasurer was like, if it looks like you shot 6 episodes
Yes.
in one sitting, so we would do an episode, and then Shushan would be like, okay, let me go change. Let me go change and come back. And
I'd even like redo my hair or like.
yeah, and then it was that it needed more than those 1 minute word explanations.
Yeah. Oh, and then after every word of
Yeah.
the day episode, then Geram and I would have like a 45-minute conversation
but-
on etymologies, on directions, and so on.
Like
Yeah.
what would make it into a
Yes.
1 minute video,
Yes.
what would not make it into it. And then finally when this came around, George Floyd killing happened, and I don't know. Yesterday I took the train home yesterday, and I was listening to that podcast, that episode again. I hadn't listened to it maybe since it came out, and I was thinking how that was the big event in our lives at the moment, and so many major calamities, very personal, Armenian and very global, have happened since then. But at that very particular moment, that was all that was happening, and we were trapped in our little cubicles in our different homes, unable to communicate. And so I wanted to translate this for a while. I wanted to initially translate from the mountaintop, but then when this happened, the letter from Birmingham jail somehow made more sense to what the language was. So I sat down, I printed out transcript of it. I had heard Dr. K's reading of it. I divided into parts of it, and then I went through each of them translating it. And then as I was translating, came face to face with these challenges of the fact that Armenian didn't provide me with the language of understanding racial justice, because those things don't exist in Armenian. So I looked through, and there isn't anything. The language that exists from that period is very archaic or doesn't exist at all. So I just sat there and then translated the whole thing. I wasn't looking for any kind of a, I don't know.
I remember
Yeah.
during peak lockdown during the pandemic, I had and I don't think I had realized this until this very moment. I had a similar urge where I translated Mkhitar Heratsi's on fevers.
Yeah.
Just because I needed to do something. And when I said this at a staff meeting, I think the only person who got it was Gerham, who was like, yep, I understand why a crazy person would translate this medieval text just for the fun of it.
Yeah, no, I initially, my plan was to translate Alpiakan Manushak into English, which Axel Bakuns's work, which soon after starting I realized that I could not, because I didn't have the English enough to English this text. I could not translate that plain language into English. But then when I was translating the English of Dr. King into Armenian, I realized how easy it was coming to me. I could twist sentences in Armenian. I cannot twist sentences in English. I don't have that skill to it. English is my third language. So it isn't easy for me to twist the sentences in a way to make Bakuns sound English. But I could make Dr. King sound Armenian. So, and then that became easier. As I was translating, I would understand it. Because the other one I went through 2 pages and then I stopped. Yeah, and then this one, it worked. It was more pliable, the English into Armenian.
These are the conversations we have after. And I think, in case I haven't said this to you, I want to say this to you at this moment, that whether it's been word of the day or language therapy or language-related anything, I think of everyone on the staff, you have been my intellectual partner and kharenkesh, which I have appreciated so much, because so much of the meaning and in masks, out of masks, in hallways, about the rabbit holes we've gone down.
I was going to say, I don't think even, we don't even have a picture of that first day of recording.
No, because we
It
weren't
was just
savvy
in the
enough.
office.
Yeah.
Me, Shushan, and our sound engineer, Rick, who came
Oh
in.
my God, Rick!
Yeah, who was very, keeping very much to the protocol because of his personal family. And then, so yeah, Rick was here. We were in the office, and we were in the room over there recording. Yeah, I think we took off our masks for the recording because the mic wouldn't pick up the sounds as much. And we did that, and then quietly got up, and the campus was empty. This whole building was empty. I mean, we had to get a special order to get into the building because the campus had already been in lockdown for 2 months.
And then Geram and Silva Savilian, sitting back there, showed up to my house with
oh my God,
what do you call that thing?
With that little Zoom mic.
Zoom mic.
And to do that intro that we did.
To do the intro, I had to empty out a closet. Silva went into the closet.
Towels
closed
around.
the door.
So for soundproofing.
She did the intro, and then Geram said, well, now you have to write an intro for this episode. I was like, okay, great. So I wrote this like super academic, like a dissertation type chapter intro, and then I got in the studio and I just read it. And then I sent it to Salpi, to the whole team, and Silva said, no. She said, channel all of your acting experience from the last 20 years, put the dissertation aside, and just speak like a human being. And I was like, okay, we'll find a nice golden medium. So we did the intro. I think the other thing, besides the fact that you were managing the social media, And what he didn't tell you is people would send very personal messages, like
Oh yes, those are
friends commenting on haircuts, on baby bumps possibly, and then Geram would walk in and say, I don't know what to do with this. And I was like, don't worry.
Yeah.
But Geram also manages all of our stats and keeps
yes.
metrics. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I jokingly say, well, I'm the archivist of the institute, so I also archive all this other stuff. But it's interesting to say that, well, this is going to be our 25th episode, and in the past 3 years, I was calculating yesterday, we have released over 1,200 recorded minutes of a podcast, which means we probably recorded 5,000 minutes. That was cut down to that. Our podcast channel, which used to be the Unpacking Armenian Studies, and now Language Therapy has its own channel, has been, we have had listeners, yesterday I was counting, from 105 countries. That was our list of the thing. We have had over 25,000 listeners up to this date, just for the Language Therapy podcast. Well, 28, 30 of you are here. So, yeah, we feel very special about that. But, yeah, the reach has been profound in that sense that the stories we get, I mean, we do realize, we've talked about this before, right? We are an academic institute. This isn't a Joe Rogan experience. We don't expect hundreds of thousands of listeners because our content is very niche. Our community is very niche at this point. Yeah, so we too see that, and then we realize that if an episode has 200 listeners, doesn't mean it was a waste of our time to do that work, because I mean, look at the listeners we have, right? So it's an absolute pleasure to do that work, knowing that it's a cross section of both our academic work and our very personal interest in this. So it's just a pleasure to do it.
So Geram sometimes will ask me if an episode has, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, 50 listeners, is it worth it? Is it worth me, Geram, Solange, Samvel, several other student workers, Silva, Lilith, the person who uploads the episode onto the Institute's website, a host of people, a host of time, a host of effort? And my answer is a resounding yes. Because like you said, we're not a nonprofit. We don't have a PR and marketing wing that promotes this. But to me, we're creating knowledge. We're creating academic content. And the beauty of a podcast is it lives. Like, it's not time-bound. It's not temporally or spatially bound. Like, 10 years down the road, someone may make use of this. Just like Lilith's dissertation. Where are you? I'm one of the 5 people who's read it, right? But it doesn't matter. It changed my life. It was worth it for you to have written it because it changed the way I see diaspora literature, right? I view it as that. Like, that's the beauty of us working at a university. That's why we chose the careers that we did. Because we get the privilege and luxury of making a podcast episode, even if 50 people listen to it. I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that. It was worth my time, I hope, Len. Worth your time.
We haven't had that where it's 50 Our average listenership of the episode is more than 1,000. So and it's gonna grow. This thing's just it's a chain effect. It keeps on growing on its own. But it has a life of on its own now.
Yeah.
It just spreads.
I actually cannot experience anything without a language therapy lens. So when I see a movie, like for my birthday, we saw the movie Past Lives. All I did during the entire movie was wonder how I could get the director as a guest on language therapy so I could ask her all my language questions. It's so funny. I mean it when I say it's become my lens to see the world. Okay, final note. Do I have your permission to share our first meaningful encounter before I joined the Institute? Do you know what it is?
I'm trying to remember. I don't think I'll
So
remember.
UCLA, I don't remember what year. I joined 2018, 2019, so it must have been before. It was at the
Yeah.
colloquium. You came up to me I think you had read a chapter I had published somewhere about language, and you said, I've written something in the Gyumri dialect, can I share it with you? Do you remember? And you emailed me.
Yeah. It feels like it's ages ago now.
Yeah.
But
So he sent me a story in the Gyumri dialect, and I don't think you knew it's my favorite dialect in the world, in any language, in any variation. Like, yeah. So that's it's. I don't think it's a coincidence that our relationship started over language and continues with and through language.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so my next guest is Sarkis Trisha, who was my research partner and conversation partner in what was probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite episode on the podcast series, which is Bulot. Sarkis Trisha, welcome again.
Thank you again for having me.
What did you think when I told you I wanted to do research on this French game that Armenians are obsessed with, and that I wanted you to join me as kind of a research assistant, given your linguistic profile, because Sarkis has gone to a French immersion school his whole life, so he's a native French speaker. What did you think was coming?
I thought I would have to like Google some things, translate some things. I didn't think it was going to be like a 9-month research project with like scholarly sources, dictionaries, live interviews,
Maple
participant
Park.
observation. So, yeah, I had no expectation, honestly. I think it started without even the podcast being part of it. I think you were interested in the game, and you had been talking about it for a couple weeks, and then you were like, do you want to just research this together and see how this happened, how this French game became such an Armenian, phenomenon. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever done as much research for an episode as we did for this one. It took an entire academic year and it just kept getting deeper and deeper to the point where we're still talking about publishing a research article on the research that we did for this episode.
Yeah, it was my first time like taking ownership of research in that sense, because I had done research projects for undergrad, papers and things, but that's a completely different level of investment to something where, it's on you to do everything. We didn't have any secondary sources about this.
We had the Gyumretsis had an association for Bulotists. Like there is an official website of the Gyumri Association for Bulot players. We had their bylaws. We had Wikipedia pages.
In French,
in
English,
in Armenian.
And I might have used some other ones like Arabic and then translated it.
We called Manuk Avetikyan, who is a colleague of ours, he's not here today, for Turkish words, because our biggest... So I brought Sarkis on for his French proficiency, only for us to discover the French was the easy part. It was the Turkish that was so much more commonly used.
Yeah. And then we realized so much of the... We talked about this on the podcast, but so much of the Turkish was from French. And like clarifying where things even came from. Sometimes we couldn't even find the answer. Or we'd look for months and then find it one day super easily after searching for months. It was super, super exciting in that sense. It was always changing.
The other thing that I remember, the plan was never for Sarkis to be my guest. My plan with the Bulot episode was that we would do like a Cheerios episode type thing and I had talked to some people here, like, could you get me sound clips of you playing Bulot with your friends, because what I had noticed was, especially with American Armenians, that again, this was a domain where Armenian was useful and instrumental. So Sarkis was supposed to be my research partner and help me get information, and then I was going to compile this like master Bulot episode. And then
I think we just ended up with so much original research content.
No, that's
No,
not what happened in my mind.
Wow. speak for you then.
You speak for you, and then I'll tell you what happened for me.
I think we just had so much to say that was original, and
Yes.
that was
Yes.
so like, you know, you don't get that experience just from presenting other people playing. You get that from analyzing in a more research context. So.
Yes, that's true. That there was so much, and we had so many conversations after all of the research. But what happened was, in all this time researching the game, and those of you who've heard the episode, you know, I ended up being obsessed with you actually playing the game, so you could have the feeling. And then we, where are you, Edo? Edo, who was in a class that Sadkis was also in, that I was teaching, we found out Edo plays balot. We got Edo to get a partner. We went into the office. We played, the four of us. First time Sadkis is ever playing. Sadkis grew up as a heritage speaker of Western Armenian. I had never heard him speak Armenian, much less Eastern Armenian.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, he started using Armenian words while we were playing.
Yeah.
And I just, like, I couldn't contain myself. I was very hard. I had to really rein it in. And then again, this is in the episode, he then messaged me that night. Well, we won.
We did.
I mean, like, massively. We yeah. And then, so I remember, like, a text exchange saying, oh, my God, that was so much fun, and we won. And then you said...
I said it was the first time I'd used Armenian as long as I could remember, and instrumentally. That was the big thing for me. I've always had a ton of language, I still do, with Armenian language anxiety. And that was an opportunity where we didn't really have a choice but to use the words, because those were the words for the game. And it came naturally because of that like restricted context. So yeah, my mind was also blown at myself.
That's when
that.
I had the idea that the arc needs to be your journey, not the game, not the rules, not the amazing research, but your journey in all of this. And it wasn't just that he was saying love, but he was saying love And I wanted, like, for a heritage Western Armenian speaker with anxiety, to say not only love, but to say lava, because we need to win this game, because apparently Dr. K is competitive. So then I thought, why not take it up a notch? I kept telling him that these grandpas gather in parks in Glendale and play balot and nardi. And he always gave me this look, because Sadkis is not from the West Coast, he's from the East Coast. These just things she says, like it's not real. He's given me many of these looks.
Bit, yeah,
but tell
maybe.
me I've come through.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So once I think we were meeting in Glendale at Urartu for another research meeting. And I said, do you want to just take a field trip to Maple Park in Glendale? And we did. And then?
Yeah, it was incredible. 40 men in various groups playing various games, most of them playing balot. It was crazy. And then we played with them.
Well, we walked up because I said, like, I want you to watch. And then the men greeted us, Barevzes, and then they saw that we were, like, animated. And they said, Chaval gitek, ayo. And then they said, Achbereta. And I said, I was like, They took out their pillows. Like, we got full hospitality, full-blown guest status, pillows, coffee, the whole thing. And then I looked at Sadkis and I was like, are you okay? And he just smiled and nodded the entire time.
Yeah, and it was fine. It was honestly fine. And I used more that time than ever before as well. And then I want to mention that since then, the trajectory has continued. This summer, I went to Armenia and, like, ended up in these situations. Not where I was playing balot necessarily, but
we were close.
But where, you know, you're talking to someone, let's say at a restaurant, and you have to just speak Armenian. Like, they don't know what you're saying in English. So it's gonna come out, and then it would just come out. Or at the airport, I remember someone talking to me, and I just started speaking Armenian. Yeah, so that trajectory has continued, and it really shows how important instrumentality is, and yeah, it's been amazing.
I think the other thing, so someone wrote to me, he will remain nameless. He's a writer and a scholar and an artist and very eccentric. And he wrote to me and he said, my goal is to be famous in this life. And the first marker is to be on your podcast. And huge compliment. And then I don't know why I thought of you, because of all my guests, I think, minus the Cheerios episode, you're the youngest person. So you didn't have the expert title, right? Usually it's an expert, it's a public figure, it's someone who has, lived experience, kind of contributed to this body of knowledge. How did it kind of feel for you to now take on this role of research partner, of collaborator?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying I've listened to podcasts for most of my life, since, early teens. And let's just say I've never seen any Armenian podcasts or heard of any until coming here. And it's a recurring theme with things at the Institute where, because of the way I grew up, I didn't think of I've never seen a bookshelf, let's say, with this many books about Armenian topics, So even the concept of an Armenian podcast, or a podcast related to Armenian things or produced by Armenians, was mind-blowing. So then participating in that, maybe it was a good thing that I didn't grow up with the baggage of knowing about that these things existed, because then maybe I'd be more afraid of participating. But I just saw it as a really great thing to contribute to. That was kind of how I approached it. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else,
I think that's been the recurring narrative with all of our partnerships. Is it's interesting because I'm always so used to getting a particular profile of an Armenian student where I have to undo the baggage and then rebuild, and then Sarkis came with tethered to nothing. He was just this is intellectually interesting. Can I be a part of it? It wasn't like the chest-beating Armenian who was trying to save the Armenian language or the Armenian world. And that was very refreshing for me to have someone who was interested in the intellectual aspect of it. And I think that's why this partnership has kind of evolved from a class project to a podcast project to now a very serious research project. That maybe we'll have a podcast episode on.
Yeah, we should.
Down the road. So, yeah. Thank you, Sarkis.
Thank you so much.
Okay, my next guest is Solange Aguero, who is the newest member of the language therapy family. I met Solange. Solange, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So 2 years ago, the USC has a Center for Languages and Cultures. The director of the center wrote to me saying we're starting a multilingual journal to get students to publish poetry in languages that they're studying at USC. And I said, how wonderful. Oh my God, we don't have Armenian. We got to work on starting Armenian. We're working on it. Then when the first issue came out, he reached out to me saying, and I suggested in one of our conversations, why not open it up to languages that are present on the USC campus, not simply languages that are taught. And he decided that it would be a great idea to feature Armenian as a guest language for the journal's next edition, and asked if I would edit and serve as a guest editor. I said yes. We got 4 submissions. 3 of them were students, some of them here that I might have gently pushed or forced. One of them was a young woman named Solange Aguero, and I looked at her name and, no Jan, nothing I recognized, who wrote this beautiful poem with allegories and metaphors going back to Armenian pagan traditions. And I remember doing Like I had one of these, and I made some suggestions for edits. They were magically accepted on a Google Doc by this Solange that I didn't know. And then later, Trojan Bloom, that's the name of the journal, said we're going to have a little celebration get together. Did I email you and ask you to come?
Yes.
Okay. I emailed and I asked all the authors to come. And then Solange walked in, she came up, we talked, and then I think like 5 minutes into the conversation, I said, do you want to be a student worker at the Institute? Email me. And then you emailed me, you came, we had a meeting, and I said, would you like to work on this podcast? What did you think was coming your way?
Well, firstly, I'm not sure whether you know this. Before you had sent that email asking us to come, I wasn't going to go originally because I was intimidated. I just transferred from GCC. And then you sent that email, I showed up, and I'm so glad I did because it changed my life. But so you had said that you didn't know what a podcast was. I knew what a podcast was, but I'd never listened to one before. So what I assumed working on a podcast would be like, I just assumed hit record, and that's it. I didn't take into the amount of time it takes to produce an episode, and I think one of the reasons why you were excited to have a new member was because you wanted a new young perspective, especially when it came to the writing. Intro and description, like you were saying, and like what Samba was saying, tend to be a little academic-y.
Can I interject with a story here? And then I have another story that you don't know that's coming your way. So we did Guéram's episode, and then we had Francois, the god of bilingualism. And I couldn't gauge how we were doing because we got a lot of amazing feedback for the first episode, all from our academic friends. And then we did Francois' episode, and I thought, I have to send this to my brother who's 2 years younger than me, who is infinitely smarter than many, many people, who is just, he knew me before I was anyone, right? No one knows you like your siblings know you, so you know you're going to get raw honesty. There is no sugarcoating. And I sent him Francois' episode, and I said, I got the god, right? Like, can you take a listen and tell me? And he knew about podcasts much more than I did. And he sent me a note back that said, this was like listening to academic porn, but you never invited us to play. And I thought, oh my God. And he said, what's your purpose in doing this? Is it for you to have fun with another academic and for you guys to kind of trade credentials and impress each other with, concepts and ideas? And that moment was very definitive for me to really clarify for myself what my purpose was. Was this to have this very closed, insular conversation with other intellectuals whom I respect, or was there a bigger mission of making these conversations accessible? So that's where I started kind of tapping into the students here to say, guys, am I talking to myself? Am I talking to fellow academics? Or does this make sense? Is this relevant to anyone else? And that's where I started inviting Samved, for example, to write descriptions. And so Solange mentioned that she's an English major, which I was thrilled, and that she writes for the Daily Trojan, not the Daily Bruin, which I keep saying. And so she was like, oh, I just read books for fun and I write reviews. And I'm like, excellent. So I said, Solange, can you start writing the descriptions of the episodes or maybe do drafts so that it doesn't sound as academic-y? So she was like, sure. And then she came back with her first description, and it was a perfect imitation of my voice. Like, I was like, Solange, I'm bringing you on not to sound like me. I'm bringing you on so you can sound unlike me. So it was a really fun kind of partnership of me kind of getting her to drop the Dr. K lens and have a Solange lens. And I think we found a very, very kind of good balance.
I think so too. And I think it's been a process, especially, obviously, when we have episodes with more academics, then of course the descriptions and the introductions tend to go more towards the academic-y side. We've had difficulty when it comes to the non-intellectuals of finding that middle ground and trying to figure out arcs and frames.
Because at this point, Samvel and Sarkis have graduated. Solange is here. She's a sophomore, so we see each other on a day-to-day basis. So I'll be like, Solange, I have an idea for an episode, and we'll kind of think through it together, and then she'll send the invitation for the guest, and then we'll do a draft of questions or kind of preliminary topics. And then when I'm in there recording, she's sitting out here listening. And then we come out, we say bye to the guest, and we debrief. And then sometimes I'll be like, I don't think I was super engaged in that conversation, and we try to figure out why. And one of the kind of realizations we came to is sometimes when the person in front of me is not an academic, I'm intellectualizing their work for them, but they don't intellectualize what they do. And it's precisely why they're so good at what they do, because they don't over-intellectualize, they just do it. But I'm like, but do you understand what you're doing? Like, do you understand how you're contributing to the theory of language and to the sociocultural, profile of Armenian? And then Solange will say, but it was a really interesting conversation. It's okay if it wasn't like an intellectual exchange. It was an interesting conversation nonetheless. And then it'll sit in the pipeline for a while, and then a month or 2 months later, I'll listen to it again, and I'll be like, Solange, you were right. It was an interesting conversation. But these are some of the kind of challenges or issues we deal with in kind of the process. So the other thing that's been really interesting is kind of, I remember, when was it? Last summer? Then the three of us met. I was panicking that Samvel is going to graduate. I was excited Solange is on board. We met at Urartu, which is my home away from home. And we did a brainstorm of like, guys, where is the future of this podcast? And Samvel keeps pushing for this to become video. What do you remember from that conversation? And I'm curious where you see the podcast going, or where you would like to see it going.
I think when I think about that question, I think back to the first time I really listened to an episode. The first time I listened to an episode, which was the Armenian Mother Guilt episode. And when I first listened to that, I remember one of my first thoughts being, this is so important because it shows a perspective that, like an unconventional perspective that you don't often listen to. And as I've listened to more episodes and as we've brainstormed about potential guests, I've realized that a big role of this podcast is kind of highlighting these perspectives, whether they're Armenian or not, that kind of go unnoticed. So I think when thinking about the future of language therapy, it's just trying to dig deeper and think of how can we illuminate our audience and ourselves through the guests that we invite. I'm also curious to know what you're looking forward to in terms of the podcast.
Yeah, I think it's been so eye-opening to reflect on the last 3 years. Like, Geram, I did the same thing. I listened to our episode, and I don't think I had listened since we first released it. By the way, when we released it, I wrote to every single human I had ever met, and I was like, I have a podcast. Take a listen. And for that episode only, I had compiled all of the responses, and we had forgotten. A couple of days ago, I was like, Geram, why don't you take a look at all of the responses we had gotten? I think one thing I realized is how much I have learned, and I don't think people realize that the knowledge we are producing is co-constructed. It's not me coming on to share. It's been funny for me to learn, and this is something Solange and I have talked about, that like guests are intimidated. And I'm like, no, I'm here to learn from you. Like, this isn't the other way around, or I'm here to have a really interesting conversation with you. So I think I'm excited about kind of settling in to my role and feeling very comfortable even when things don't go the way I initially imagined, when conversations go in directions I wasn't prepared for. And sometimes those are the best moment in a conversation. That's really exciting. I've had some really interesting aha moments that I'm kind of excited to have. Like, I remember we had an episode with a professional interpreter. And I remembered the moment I realized that his job isn't just a linguistic job, it's an acting job. Because the guy is up there performing and embodying a human being that's there next to him. And he's speaking for a prime minister where his words will determine a particular resolution or a particular policy that may change the shape that our country takes, right? And, you know, asking him, like, what do you do about tone? And what do you do when you vehemently disagree with what's being said? Or what do you do about, you know, so many things? I remember having those moments of, or I remember, like, crying in the studio, like, grieving together. And just, like, realizing we're just going to sit silently and do this together. And that's okay. Like, that's actually what should be happening. So I'm looking forward to those moments. I'm looking forward to being a little bolder about disagreeing with some of my guests. I think I tend to be very compromising and very accommodating, but recently we recorded an episode. So we have about 7, 8 in the pipeline at any point. And what happens is some are planned and then some will happen because of current events or because someone's in town or because, you know, there's a linguist from Scotland who's working on Western Armenian phonetics. And I'm like, let's pop you into the studio. So I don't know where I was going with this. Being bolder. Like, we had mapped out together a series of topics or types of guests I'd like to have. When I found out that Snoop Dogg is having a concert in Armenia, I remember writing to Solange and going, I want Snoop Dogg on the podcast. Not because he's having a concert in Armenia, because I want to talk about the transgressive nature of rap and what rappers have done with language, right? That's what I want to talk about. Or, I don't know, what else have we talked about? There's a polyglot who's going to be in town, an Armenian polyglot who started as a half French, half Armenian young man growing up as French in France. And then his Armenian aunt, visited the house and told his father, why don't you send him to Armenia? So he might want to know where he comes from. He went to Armenia and kind of had an awakening, and then went to Russia, learned Russian, and then went to Lebanon, learned Arabic, and then learned Armenian, and then learned a bunch of other languages. And, you know, like, I really want to get that perspective. I really want to get Viet Thanh Nguyen. I don't know if any of you know the actor Gabriel Burns. Okay, some people know, thank God. But he's a huge activist for the Irish language, in addition to being a phenomenal actor. I want to make those cultural parallels. Like, having Gustavo Arellano was really important for me. I remember we were here in the studio talking, and then he came and he lectured for my class. And he said, do you understand that just calling someone Mexican is derogatory? Like, I don't think I had realized that from a Mexican person's perspective. That in the American context, to call someone Mexican to a Mexican seems derogatory. Like, what does that do to your ethnic and linguistic identity, right? I kind of want to have those parallels, because I think someone asked, how come you don't have the word Armenian in the title of this podcast? Why isn't it called the Armenian language therapy or language therapy for Armenians? And I said, because language is so much bigger than Armenians, right? Language is language. We just happen to be Armenian, and we happen to be speakers of Armenian, and we happen to find Armenian harazat and beautiful and enriching, right? But I think my biggest mission with this podcast is to make sure that the topics we cover are relevant for Armenians, but are relevant for any speaker, any bilingual, anyone who thinks about language or thinks about language policy, any bilingual, any multilingual, and so on and so on. So I think I want to be bolder and go wider with the podcast. It's a lot of work, and I'm really happy I have people like you. And I want to tell you a little story that I think you don't know. So you mentioned the first time we met that you had gone to Shamilyan.
Yes.
And that you had this wonderful teacher named Arak Zarzavatian.
Yeah.
I wrote to her, and I told her I met you, and that I was really impressed with your poem and with your work. And she wrote to me saying, "You have no idea what's coming your way. Enjoy her as I have enjoyed her." So yeah, from one teacher to another, we had a moment, and she was absolutely right. So I guess final question for you is, how has working on the podcast kind of influenced your perspective, your self-realization, your kind of worldview?
I guess on the intellectual level, I feel like I'm always learning. From the moment, either I'll help you reach out to a guest, or you're like, this person is coming on Wednesday, do some research. I feel like from the moment I Google their name, I look at their work, I'm already learning. Then I listen to the episode, I learn some more. I write the description, I keep on learning. So on that end, I feel like I've grown so much, but also on a personal level, like you said before, both of my names are in Armenian. And so I always struggled with trying to figure out, is my perspective as a half Armenian valuable? Can I take ownership of my identity as an Armenian in whichever way, but especially, I guess, in an intellectual, academic realm? And I guess learning and talking with you and listening to our episodes in which we highlight these different perspectives, and where we have this like commitment to highlighting different types of people and different types of stories, has reaffirmed the importance of these different of hybridity and cross-culturalness, and continuing to push for individuals' voices to be heard. And I guess that's what I've taken from the podcast, and I'm excited to keep learning.
Me too. Thank you so much. Okay, so we are now ready for your questions.
But just a question to Dr. K. Dr. K, I see, you have a lot of like language professionals that come on the podcast, but like recently for me, I'm doing this rotation where I have like an Armenian speaking patient, and I'm on a palliative care rotation, so we have very deep conversations about, life, and he's like very ill, and it's just so difficult for me when I go talk to him, and then I have to go see like an English speaking patient. Words don't come out of my mouth because I have to translate back and forth. And just if you have any plans of inviting some of the community doctors from Glendale who have to kind of rotate back and forth between the Armenian medical terminology, especially like deep emotional conversation, and then switch back to English. And I think Dr. Pogosian would also appreciate if we can get some doctors here, just another professional in the medical field.
Absolutely. I've already spoken to my children's pediatrician because all three of my kids have been born in Glendale. All three of their pediatricians have been Armenian and Armenian speaking. Once we had an emergency and our usual pediatrician was not available, and someone from their team had to see my daughter, who wasn't Armenian nor Armenian speaking, and my daughter would not communicate because to her, the pediatrician always speaks Armenian. So she said, "Iskakam bjishk ch'es bjishk," right? Or I remember I was at UCLA folks in the YRL elevator, and the nanny called me, and all I heard was, and I was like, please God, tell me it's the elevator, right? Doing this to my phone. It's not that and nanny actually hyperventilating. And so I got out of the elevator and I said, "Ինչ ա եղել?" And she said, "Աթոռ անգելա քթին, քթից արյուն ա գալիս, ամբողջ կյանքում քիթը ծուռ ա լինելու." We had this, and I said, like, I'm an hour and 15 minutes away at most. Do we need to call 911? Calm down. Like, I'm speaking, I was so impressed with how cool and collected and all of this. And she said, "No, I think it's okay." I said, "Well, let me call Vach. He's 10 minutes away." I hang up, I call Vach. So Vaj gets home, grabs the baby, takes her to the Armenian pediatrician. An hour later, I come in, I walk in, and I just start bawling, and the pediatrician starts crying with me. And instead of everyone focusing on the baby, she's like, "Hangստացի, ամեն ինչ լավ ա." And the fact that she was speaking Armenian to me, like at that moment, in my moment of vulnerability, I needed her to speak Armenian to me. And I have so many medical professionals around me whom I've asked, one, how important it is for the quality of care that in your moment of vulnerability, you have someone who can speak that language with you. But two, also instrumentally, when you have patients who don't have command of English and who don't understand what's happening to them. And on both levels, or really at the instrumental level, like a friend of ours, her brother is MD, and he talked about interviewing at Kaiser. And he said, I was sitting in a room full of doctors who were equally, if not more qualified than I was. And what got me the job was that I knew Armenian. Right? And this is something, because our kids will always tell us, what's the value in knowing Armenian? You know, the very pragmatic value. So I think on all levels. And then recently, when we did the Hayeren event, I had a doctor come up to me and pull me aside, a much older doctor who said, not only do I know Armenian and English, I can do the Hayastansi and the Beirutsi. And he said, you should see the things I do with my patients when they walk in, because he's the child of a repat in Armenia. So his parents spoke Western. He was born and raised in Armenia, speaks Eastern, so he can do both. And so absolutely, you are welcome to be my guest, by the way. That's a topic I have been wanting to pursue. I also have friends in the medical field who will text me and say, how do you say, I don't know, gastro something? And I'm like, I don't know, that's beyond my competency, right? So then I'll have to like look up, dictionaries and then respond. But
remember we did gallbladder for word
we
of the
did
day?
gallbladder for word of the day. Yeah. No, but this is definitely on the list of topics to cover. Yeah. 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 Ay, ay, ay.
Thank you for organizing this event. I've been listening for, I guess, 3 years now, so this is special. So thank you for having us all together. I actually did want to second the question regarding the medical terminology, because I think that's, I'm a Western Armenian speaker, and I have a lot of, my parents did medicine in Armenia, so they got their medical training in Eastern Armenian. So for me, medical Armenian terminology is more Eastern Armenian than Western Armenian. And there's a lot of Arabic and Turkish and Western Armenian medical terminology that Eastern Armenian speakers don't necessarily understand. So that's not even my question, but that's something that I think should be addressed. My question, so growing up I was an only child. I think this question, I never had this thought cross my mind until I had some friends growing up in Glendale that, so I came to America as a child. I'm an only child. I only spoke Armenian with my parents at home. That was the primary language. And then I had a lot of friends that also grew up in the old country, whether that's the Middle East or in Armenia, where Armenian was their primary home language. So when they had siblings, they spoke to their siblings in Armenian. And then when they come to America, at some point, I guess it all depends on the age, when they come to America, most of them continue to speak English, Armenian with their parents, but then at some point there's a switch where the siblings start to speak English with each other. So what are those factors that cause that switch, and when does that usually happen? I think it's usually when the older kid starts to take that dominant language on, probably, but it's just an interesting phenomenon that I never experienced as an only child, but I think it's very relevant to a lot of people that have siblings growing up.
Yeah, so first about your comment.
Yeah, so
first about your comment. One of the episodes that's in the pipeline that'll come out is with writer and translator Karen Gharslian, who 9 to 5 is a professional medical translator. I didn't know. So there is a company that provides tele-translations all over the United States, and you just choose Armenian and they connect you to him, and he's sitting in his bedroom with his kid on his lap, apparently, and translating. And he talked about not only translating the medical terminology, but also cultural aspects. And I don't want to give too much of the episode away, but Armenian patients, because he also translates Russian as well, their patients' disinclination to ask questions or dig further, to just accept the diagnosis or the statement by the doctor. Lack of knowledge about medical terminology and then so he'll be translating for the doctor, and then, for example, it's a sister explaining to a sister what's happening, and they will mistranslate the bone that's broken, and then he ethically is not supposed to intervene, but he will ask permission to intervene and say they misspoke, right? They're completely misrepresenting the situation. So so interesting, Eastern Western issues. So that's something to look forward to. That's coming. I also just to the two questions, my first quarter at UCLA as an undergrad, very overwhelming. I went from what I thought was a very large high school, Glendale High, to 30,000 students. I was in a discussion for an art history class, and I saw a last name Abdian, and I got so excited, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and we both are like, I see you, I recognize you. So we walk out of class, and we like collide, and I'm like, you're Armenian, right? He's like, you're Iranian, right? And we both are disappointed, like, no. And then I was like, but you know, we could still be friends. And he was pursuing a pre-med. And then he went away for a medical school, and then I got an email years later saying, do you have access to an Armenian English medical dictionary? Because he was doing residency in LA and wanted this access. So this kind of back to this instrumental use. Now to your question, all the research demonstrates the trajectory that you just described. So the first child gets the most access to adult interaction. Also, as a parent of a first child, where you are now, remember this because you're not going to be like this with your second or third. All your energy is invested. This is your guinea pig child. You think you have all the magic powers in the world. You will produce a native-speaking Armenian child in the United States. You will be the one and only who will produce a native-speaking Armenian child, and you will succeed for a while. You will think you are the exception to the rule. Your child will be the exception to the rule. And then at age 5, your child will go to preschool or kindergarten, even if it's in an Armenian school, and within 6 months, your child will become a dominant English speaker. And you will be crushed. And you will remember this day. And then you'll plan trips to Armenia every summer, right? Or whatever it is. The moment the first child transitions to English, and if there is a second child around, first of all, you are not as available. Adult interaction is not as available. And your second child's favorite person is no longer you. It's their older sibling. And the older sibling has already transitioned to English. They want to be them, not you. Right? And I think people will ask, well, how come in the Middle East siblings spoke to each other in Armenian? Because in the Middle East, Armenian was the prestige language. Not Arabic, not Persian. In the US and in the world, English is the prestige language. Disney is in English, right? Their favorite toys are in English. Their favorite video games are in English. And their favorite person in the world, their older sibling, is now an English speaker because their sibling has entered school, and all the really important people that they are now trying to impress are English-speaking people, even in Armenian school. So it is what it is. We can talk later. I mean, we just had a phone conversation a week ago. We can have another conversation about how to manage those dialects, those kind of dynamics. But that's all research shows that in all language communities, not just the Armenian. Questions?
So, you know, in the beginning of the podcast episode, you said something about not feeling like this is the limit, like feeling like, you know, it's expansive. And as a mother and an educator and now podcast host, I'm wondering if you realize kind of your role in as someone who inspires everyone who listens to you. And I'm wondering if you do recognize that in yourself, where do you think that kind of voice inside yourself comes from? And if you do continue to cultivate it, how do you continue to cultivate it?
Do I recognize it? Yes and no. I think there's like there's a battle between Dr. K and Shushan. That kind of like Dr. K persona, who is so put together, who is this academic person who has research to back up everything she says. And then there's my lived experience as Shushan, as a mother of 3 kids, where everything is chaotic, where sometimes I have a good day and sometimes I think I failed. And I think when Solange and I were talking and I was saying I've kind of settled in, I think I've gotten better at kind of merging those two together, that they can coexist, that I can have the expertise when I'm talking to Jeannot about dual immersion for his kids, but I can also struggle in my own home environment or interpersonal relationships. Like, we went to Armenia this summer, and there are moments where I have language anxiety, right? And here I am telling everyone how to handle their own anxiety, but there are domains that I feel very uncomfortable in because I've never been exposed to them. Whether it's like in a medical setting, or I think we're in a taxi and they're talking about traffic, and all of my traffic words are in English, right? Or they're too proper for a cab driver, where I'm like, you know, he's like rolling his eyes, right? Because I'm talking like a textbook, right? So I think kind of coming to terms with, and you can't, I don't know. I guess we need a psychologist to say, can you like provide therapy for yourself, right? Sometimes Dr. K needs to like bring therapy for Shushan, but I do recognize it, and I recognize it because of these people here, right? Because I work in an environment where I have young people who I engage with, whose self-realization I'm privileged to be witness to and privileged to have a role in. I think that's when I really understand the impact and significance of what we're doing, because I get it firsthand with them. And then, of course, I get it with my kids. Like, my middle daughter was in Armenia for 3 weeks, and she's been going to a dual immersion program for a couple of years, but she's a second child, so she's already transitioned to English a while ago. And now my older daughter is the language police at our house. We no longer do it. She polices us. She'll roll her eyes and be like, you responded to her in English. And I'm like, I'm too tired. It's okay, right? So she had anxiety, the second child. Would her Armenian be enough for her trip to Armenia? Then she gets to Armenia, and my dad calls and says she's hanging out with the neighborhood kids, and she yells from the buck. She says, "Papik serandir engelneris het galis." And I'm like, Dad, what did you do? He's like, oh, I laid out the best table there possibly was, right? Her entire status in this neighborhood is now dependent on that. And she called me and she said, Mom, գիտես ինչ եմ նկատել Հայաստանում? And I said, ինչ? She said, you know how we say ստեղ, ընդեղ? I'm like, yeah. She's like, ընդեղ ղ չեն ասում են արի ստե, գնա ընդեղ. And she's like, well, yes, սկսել եմ իրանց նման խոսել. I'm like, good for you, baby. Like, right, it's her first realization of the layers of colloquial. And then she said, Mom, isn't it weird that people who've met me for 2 minutes call me Bales? Right? Look at this 8-year-old's realization that in Armenia, everyone is everyone's child. That people she's just met, strangers, really call her Bala, right? And I was like, oh my God, my kid's developing linguistic meta-awareness. Like, this is happening. So, but then my kids get annoyed at the whole Dr. K situation. That's also a thing. Like, we'll be sitting around the dinner table and one of my kids will say something and I'll be like, did you notice that you did this? And then Ani, my older daughter, will roll her eyes and be like, can we just be a normal family for once? Like, could we not psychoanalyze every utterance we have? So there's kind of internal struggles on my end. But at the end of the day, I feel very privileged to be a mother to my 3 kids and to be a mentor or play a role in kind of my students' lives. Yeah.
How do you keep coming up with topics that are applicable and really make people excited for your podcast?
So, first of all, I think when Salpi, our former director, offered me the opportunity to join this team, I said, Salpi, I have a trip to Armenia planned. I just want you to know I'm going to start in April, but in June we're going to go to Armenia. She said, sure, no problem. And then June comes, and I told the staff, I think I had mentioned that I'm going to Armenia. I get on the plane, and Zaven approaches me and says, "Can we take a selfie?" And then Silva messages me instantly saying, "Have a safe flight," only for me to find out Zaven had messaged our entire team with our selfie. So, thank you for that. Okay, when we first started the podcast, I still have the notebook. I have a notebook with like 5 to 10 pages of dream guests, dream topics, and they're interspersed guests and topics. And then life kicked in and things happened, right? So the dream guests and the dream topics exist, and that's a list I refer to, but most of the time I never make it to the list because I'll read a book that inspired me and I'll try to either interview the author or some topic in the book inspired me and I'll find another interlocutor. I'll watch a movie, a fellow academic will drop by. A student will say something in class that will inspire an idea. Just like I said in the beginning, like language is everywhere. It's everything. It's inevitably connected to everything we do. So most of the time, the topic just kind of falls on the table in front of me and it's up to me to frame it. That's where the responsibility is. It's not so much what topic to discuss and who the interlocutor is. It's how to frame it so that it's done in a way that's sensitive, respectful, but also pushes the boundaries a little bit. And I think it's gotten more interesting because I'm getting a little bolder, a little more comfortable with taking more ownership of kind of the framing of it. There's never a shortage of topics. Actually, so many of our guests will complain and say, our interview was months ago, or they'll say like, is something wrong with it? And I say, no, there's interviews in the pipeline, but then current events hit, right? Like current events hit where the timing of a particular episode is very important at that moment. And then it'll live, right? And it'll live in the record. But like when we did the interview with George Burnutian or with Geram, those were very important for that moment and very important for our mental health. Because I think as we're getting older, we realize we're studying and doing what we do to better understand ourselves, right? We all need therapy. So the work we're doing, fortunately for us, is kind of providing that. So yeah, that's how we kind of go about with the topics.
First of all, thank you very much for this very special evening. This has been amazing. And you've touched on this a bit throughout the interviews, but you've done 3 years now, 25, this is your 25th episode. As you look back, 2 questions. Which one, if any one in particular, stands out as like your most favorite episode, podcast, and why? And then as you look back or think about your dream list, what is one you're still hoping to accomplish?
Great questions. I don't know I think the Cheerios episode was really special to work on because there hadn't been any treatment of that word, of that concept in academia, in social environments, even comedy hadn't touched it. So, and the pieces of it, I think so each episode has a folder in our Google Drive, and the folder has like audio file, original, cut 1, cut 2, cut 3, transcript, intro, description, title, whatever, right? The Cheerios episode has like 20 something audio files, right? Because we had kind of gathered bits and pieces here and then putting that together, I was like, oh my God, this is what like movie makers do, right? They cut pieces together. So I think that one definitely stands out, and the kind of reactions we've received for that one. So colleagues of mine who teach Armenian will say this is the one they use most frequently in the classroom because it generates such a strong response from young people. So I think that one definitely stands out. The Bulot one we talked about. My episode with Mary Basmadjian, the comedian, was a very important one because she was so shy. Here was this larger than life comedian that I had seen and admired and kind of thought about and had all these mental conversations. By the way, most of my guests don't know that I've talked to them in my mind for a long time. And then it's kind of a funny feeling to get to do it in person. And then we logged on Zoom, and she was painfully shy. And in the beginning, I was just like, I'm fangirling, and I'm trying to get her to get excited. And she was just, like very quiet, very susik-pusik. And I was like, do you understand the impact of your work? And I'm saying this and I'm saying that. And then only, I think, like second hour into the podcast did she start to open up. And it was my realization of, the artist's persona and the kind of the person inside are not the same, right? Actually, it's the shyest people usually who have these larger than life personas. So that one. And I've also had people, men especially, come to me and say, do you really like what Mary Basmajian does? Like, do you really like Vartushtota? And I'm like, yes. I really do. Sometimes they think I'm just being polite during the podcast, and I'm not. I really do love what she does. Who's a dream guest? Snoop Dogg is not a dream guest. I really want to talk about rap, so I just need a rapper. So if you have a rapper in mind, that would be great. Viet Thanh Nguyen, I'm coming for you. It's coming. I'm writing you an email in the next couple of days. I don't know. I think that's how we've matured. I don't think I have a dream guest. I think the beauty of being at USC and having this platform is, and this is something that Silva does so well on our team. I think she reminds us that we are in a position where we do have access to everyone and anyone. We have a platform that's prestigious, that's respected, that's venerable, because people don't question the integrity of the work that we do. And as Geram said, I have the street creds, apparently, to do the work that I do. So yeah, I think it's more the kind of dream conversation. And the dream conversation is the following, that I do one of these, and you've probably heard it, I'm like, I'll do this during the conversation, because, just like with dissertation research, you go in with a skeleton, with a frame, and you kind of know what to expect. And then sometimes people surprise you. They say things. It's a moment where I'm like, I can't believe I hadn't thought of that, or I can't believe I hadn't seen it this way. Like, those are the dream conversations where I'm taken off guard. Yeah, I think that's what I'm looking forward to.
Last question?
Yeah.
If you were to encounter an alien, a Martian who came to Earth and didn't know what an Armenian was, and you were going to, or you had to describe kind of the essence, the soul of our language, how would you do that? What words would you use, either in Armenian or English? How would you convey that feeling you get when you speak Armenian?
That's a note to end on.
Last question.
Yeah. I would probably use the word harazat. It's taken me a long time, and this is something I've asked people a lot, only to realize I didn't have an answer for myself, what my favorite word is in Armenian. And the reason I love the word harazat is because you can't convey it directly. You have to say it's like a marriage between familial and familiar. And I call it, you all know this in this room, the Armo radar. You know, when you walk into a room, you immediately scan the room and you make eyes. And you're like, I see you. Hopefully it's not an Iranian, or it's fine if it's an Iranian. But sometimes it misfires. But what you see is the harazatness, right? It's not appearance. It's like, I see the way you stand and you see the world. I see the world like that too, right? Or I assume I see the world like that too. And then the moment you say in Armenian, hayes, because it's different, and my students and I have done these experiments in class. If you go up to another Armenian after the radar fires and you say, are you Armenian? It's a very different interaction than when you go hayes. Because the moment you do that, it says, like you're coming to my house for dinner, right? Like I've shared the story in class. My husband and I, so in our family, we have a tradition during the holidays. Every year, one family member picks the Christmas tree. And before we were 4, now we're 5, so it rotates. And so, and we honor it. Like the others do not get to influence the decision. And usually we go to this place in La Crescenta, and usually the folks who run the place are not Armenian. And this last year we went, and Vaj is holding Arev. It's her year. And an Armenian man, the radar immediately fires. He approaches. We don't even do the highest. We're like, he grabs her from Vaj in his arms, and he goes, right? And like, that's normal. That's harazat, right? Like, that's the essence, that no matter where you are, in whatever context you are, there's a recognition of familiarity and of being, and it's Arev's comment, right? That they've only known me for 2 minutes, but they call me Bales. That it's this like one extended tribe and family that everyone belongs to. All you have to do is see and be seen. Like, be willing to see and be willing to be seen. Right? It's there. It's just up to you to like engage in the radar being triggered. And that's it. So I think that's what I would say. It's the harazatness of it. Okay. Should we wrap up? Lilith's job is to wink at me and hold up sheets of paper to say, okay, so thank you guys so much. This was such a treat. We're so excited for bringing newer, bolder, more interesting episodes to you guys. And please continue with your feedback, because maybe you don't know, but behind the scenes, they make a really big difference for us. Thank you guys. Nice to meet you.